right, Gerald, good to see you again. You got another, first of all, you got another book. This is number what?
Well, let's say 3 dozen.
So this was the one. So was it when you were doing COVID? You had so much extra time. You said, "Let me just crank this one out."
Well, basically, what happened, to get down into the weeds, is that with COVID, I went into lockdown that I did not exit until last fall. But what I did was I obtained a microfilm reading machine, and that allowed me to read a lot of microfilm, particularly from the early days of Texas and Mexico, and take notes and help to produce this book.
Wow. Wow. Well, I mean, it's first of all, it's a whole lot. And before we actually get into the book, again, for folks who just don't understand this process, I mean, how much? First of all, we're talking about 575 pages. How long did it take you to research and write?
Well, that's a good question. Keep in mind, when you do these books, you don't work on them every day. At least I don't. And because usually I'm working on 2 or 3, perhaps 4 projects at a time. Having said that, I would say that this book, which was published in 2022, I probably began in 2016, 2017.
Wow. So about a 5-year period.
Exactly.
So you called it the counter-revolution of 1836. Why?
Well, as you know more than most, given your roots in the U.S. Southwest, Texas was once part of Mexico. But the slave owners of Texas, led by Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston, who gave their names to 2 of the major cities in what is now a U.S. state, were opposed to the abolition of slavery in Mexico, executed by a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, 200 years, by the way, before the election of Barack Obama in the United States in 2008. And rather than accede to abolition, they seceded, fought a war, defeated Mexico on the battlefield, not least with armed resistance and supplies from the United States of America, and then began to expand the enslavement of Africans. In fact, when Texas was an independent country between 1836 and 1845, not only could the slave ships of the Lone Star State be found off the coast of Angola and Brazil and Cuba, but as well, keep in mind that these leaders in Texas were so full of themselves that they thought that they could challenge the United States of America, despite the fact that the States of America helped them to solidify their independence from Mexico. So it's a very tawdry tale, at least in the early stages. And I don't feel you can begin to understand why it is that Texas has the largest Black population in the United States of America as we speak, without understanding this history. And I don't think you can begin to understand why Texas plays an outsized role in right-wing politics in the United States of America without understanding the anti-African sentiment that helped to drive independence and then statehood, and without understanding as well the bloody wars against the indigenous population. In fact, even though California might quibble with this point, Texas probably had the bloodiest wars of all against the indigenous population, which at the end of the day helped to create more land and territory for the enslavement of Africans.
It's interesting. The other day I was on social media and I came across something that was interesting. There was a brother who did a video to explain why there's a sliver of Oklahoma that's just above the panhandle in Texas. And he, in the video, he goes, slavery. And again, as a native Texan, I saw that and I was like, wow, I didn't even realize that. Explain that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. The shape of Oklahoma has been described as a bloody cleaver hanging over Texas. It's interesting about the state of Oklahoma as well. I'm sure you have listeners in the Sooner State. And Oklahoma was originally designed to be a Bantustan, not unlike what you had during apartheid South Africa, where the Africans were moved into certain territories and not allowed to move elsewhere. Recall that then US President Andrew Jackson, who was Donald Trump's favorite president, he had his picture hanging on the wall in his office. It was Andrew Jackson who now graces the $20 bill, perhaps more accurately, disgraces the $20 bill, who expelled the indigenous population of the Southeast Quadrant of the United States, present-day Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and told them they could live in this Bantustan, Indian territory, for as long as the water shall flow and the grass shall grow. And what's interesting about some of these indigenous populations, particularly the Cherokee, was that they were willing to accommodate themselves and assimilate to Euro-American society, converting to Christianity, becoming sedentary farmers, up to and including enslaving Africans, by the way. And so when they were expelled, they brought their enslaved property with them to Indian territory. But alas, as you know more than most, Black people in North America have a penchant for rebellion, and they began to rebel against Native American territory. And it was very difficult for them because they had to cross Texas territory to get to freedom in Mexico. So this is a very troubled history. And once again, I don't think you can begin to understand the rancid conservatism that now persists in Oklahoma and Texas without understanding this history. And by the way, allow me to make a footnote about the Tulsa massacre of 100 odd years ago. I'm sure many in your audience are familiar with what happened in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, oftentimes described as Black Wall Street. And to the extent that the nickname is accurate, you have to trace it back to the slavery days. You have to trace it back to 1865 when slavery was abolished. And the Indian slave owners were forced to disgorge more of their wealth and property to the formerly enslaved than their Euro-American counterparts. And that helped to create a somewhat relatively lucrative community, affluent community, I should say. And this was too much for many of the settlers. And that led directly to the Tulsa massacre circa 1921, when hundreds were massacred. Their graves are still being uncovered as we speak. Many of them were forced to flee. Some of them left the country. Some of them moved to Canada. So once again, this is a very unfortunate history that needs to be better known.
So on the cover here, you have an image of folks being lynched. You have the Texas flag, but you have this Nazi flag. Why?
Well, I'm afraid to say that the direction in which the United States is heading right now is very perilous. It's not me who's raised the F word instantly. Recall that during the campaigns, congressional campaigns last year, President Joseph R. Biden suggested that the United States under Republican Party rule could be headed towards fascism. It was the late Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who wrote an entire book, Fascism, A Warning, about that. Many leaders, intellectuals are very concerned about this, which could portend the acceleration of already toxic trends, those toxic trends being more Black people on death row, more Black people being subjected to police terror, more Black people treated like Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, with the authorities knocking down your door and coming in and killing you. And so what I'm arguing in this book is that to the extent that we are worried about the rise of fascism in the United States, which once again would just be an acceleration of already existing trends, we have to understand that Texas in particular has created fertile soil for the rise of fascism, given the fact that it was a premier state for enslavement. As I talk about in the book, as the so-called Confederate States of America was collapsing, I'm speaking of the states in the Deep South, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, et cetera. Recall that in 1861, they decided to leave the United States because they wanted to enslave Africans forevermore and overthrow the government under Abraham Lincoln and Washington as a result. As their dream was collapsing, you saw that many enslavers began to move en masse to Texas with their property in tow because they felt that Texas had the best chance of surviving and basically continuing slavery.
Fanbase is pioneering a new era of social media for the creator economy. This next generation social media app with over 600,000 users is raising $17 million, and now is your chance to invest. For details on how to invest, visit startengine.com/fanbase or scan the QR code. Another way we're giving you the freedom to be you without limits.
There's a story about Juneteenth that I could tell if we have time that helps to illustrate that point.
Yeah, we got time.
Okay, well, let me digress for a moment. You know the story about Juneteenth, I'm sure. June 16th, 1865, supposedly General Granger of the U.S. government shows up in Galveston and tells the enslaved Africans, hey, did you people know you were free? Didn't you hear about the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863? Well, that's more or less a fairy tale because the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln did not apply in jurisdictions that Lincoln did not control. It would be as if the U.S. Congress passed a resolution saying that slavery is abolished in, let us say, Mauritania and Northwest Africa. Well, unless the U.S. Congress put boots on the ground in Northwest Africa, and I don't want to put ideas in their head, given their propensity for intervening in foreign lands, unless they put boots on the ground, that would just basically be a paper resolution. And that was the impact and effect of the Emancipation Proclamation until General Granger and his troops showed up to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. The Africans in Galveston, they knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, but what could they do? They were being forced at gunpoint to work for free. But what happens is that during the period of the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a close ally of the slave owners, speaking of France, had seized control of Mexico. This leads to the Mexican-American holiday, Cinco de Mayo, which you may be familiar with, your audience may be familiar with, which celebrates a victory of Mexican opposition forces over the French occupiers. So the idea in Texas and in the Confederate States in general was to retreat en masse to the border area with Mexico, perhaps go back into Mexico and reverse the abolitionist decree that I mentioned a moment or two ago, issued by the Black president, Vicente Guerrero, and continue enslavement of Africans forevermore. But what happens is that the U.S. Army then had a few 100,000 Black men in uniform with guns in their hand. They allied with Mexican opposition forces led by the Mexican national hero, Benito Juarez. Ciudad Juarez, just across the border from El Paso, Texas, is named after him. And they helped to crush the French occupiers. And in fact, that helped to crush the idea that slavery would continue in Mexico, in league with Texas enslavers and Virginia enslavers and Carolina enslavers. And one could fairly say that the real Juneteenth is June 19th, 1867, when the Black men with guns in hand, allied with Mexicans also with guns in hand, crushed the French occupiers, and not only crushed the French occupiers, but then execute the French leader in Mexico, Maximilian, on June 19th, 1867. And that brings the United States closer to enslavement, more so than the original story of Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, which we had been fed.
What's interesting about that is because when you look at, again, Texas lore, those of us born and raised in Texas, required to have Texas history in the 7th grade, when we're told about the Alamo, and this great story about the fight to save Texas. The Alamo was about slavery.
Absolutely. And of course, many of the Euro-American settlers who were, quote, defending, unquote, the Alamo against incursions from Mexican forces were not only enslavers, but in some cases, slave traders. And it's interesting, as I point out in the book, one of the ways we know what happened in the Alamo, which, as you, I'm sure, recall, is cited within the confines of San Antonio, Texas, is that an enslaved African was either allowed to escape by Mexicans or somehow escape, and he was then able to spread the story of what happened at the Alamo, which has now become a kind of a sacred site with regard to many Texans. You may know that a lot of our tax dollars in Texas have been spent restoring the Alamo. The British musician who now lives in the United States, speaking of Phil Collins, has become a benefactor of the Alamo site for whatever reason. I'm not really sure how he got so intrigued by this story, and has pumped a lot of his fortune into restoring the Alamo. It's a very curious story.
Well, I think that the reason I raised that is because I think back to the phrase that you always heard Paul Harvey say, "Now the rest of the story."
Right.
And when I think about the attacks on the 1619 Project, I think about the attacks on Black historians. When I think about when we talk about the redefinition of American history, again, as somebody who was born and raised in Texas, we were raised to celebrate the Alamo. It was about Texas fighting against these savages from Mexico who were trying to take over, and these were independent-minding people. And so you got Black folks who are walking around, remember the Alamo, and movies were made about it. And so you want us to remember that the people who were fighting for the Alamo wanted to keep us in chains. And what they want is, and bringing it present day, they don't want people today to know or as Paul Harvey said, the rest of the story, the other side of that story. And so we want to keep up this fantasy, because in this country, that's what it's all about. The fantasy of American history, where white Americans were always the saviors and were perfect and they were just wonderful, when in fact, what we're talking about are just prime examples of pure evil.
Well, that's an understatement, I'm afraid to say. And this is very serious. Even though we're talking about events of the past, they have contemporary resonance. That's the only way to explain what's going on in the state of Florida now, with Governor DeSantis, who is now on the verge of declaring that he will be running for the Republican nomination for president against Mr. Trump, has campaigned relentlessly with regard to what he describes as, quote, wokeness, unquote, which in many ways comes down to campaigning against an accurate rendition of Black history. That's why he sought to circumscribe the teaching of advanced placement African-American studies in secondary schools in the state of Florida. That's why in the New York Times today, March 30th, 2023, you have an article by Charles Blow, the Black columnist, who describes an effort in the state of Florida to prevent the showing of a docudrama about the little Black girl, Ruby Bridges, in Louisiana, who tried to desegregate a school and was subjected to harassment and persecution by Euro-American adults as a direct result. That's why in the state of Florida, you have campaigns against novels by the Nobel laureate, the late Black woman writer and creator, Toni Morrison. It's not as if this campaign is directed against any ideas about overthrowing the United States government or something of that sort. It's just there's a campaign against an accurate rendition of Black history. And there are those like Governor DeSantis and his acolytes who feel that an accurate rendition of Black history calls into question the creation myth about the United States of America. That is to say that it is a flawless nation. It's a nation without blemishes, that in order to uphold that fiction and fantasy, we have to whitewash, pardon the expression, great swaths of the historical record. And this is quite dangerous, as I'm sure you can understand, to our younger people in particular. Because on the one hand, they're growing up wondering why it is that they're being harassed by the police, why they're being stopped when they're driving their cars, and others who do not have the same content of melanin or not treated similarly. And if they had a better understanding of the history of this country, they can understand the reality of this country. And if they can understand the reality of this country, they might want to protest against the reality of this country. But Governor DeSantis and his comrades, the last thing they want to see is the specter of Black people protesting against racism and white supremacy.
COVID happened, poor people were dying at a rate already of 800 people a day. Before COVID, if you went to a funeral every single day, it would take you 600 years to attend all the funerals of the people who will die from the ravages of policy violence, poverty, and low wages in America in just 1 year. It would take you 2 years and 19 days to go to all of the funerals of the people that will die today, and oftentimes silence. Nobody talks about this political genocide, but we are determined today to remember their death and be a resurrection of voting power and voice power like never before.
Economic justice and saving this democracy are deeply connected. We, as a nation, must listen to the demands of the poor, who are pushing and will continue to push political candidates and elected leaders to lift from the bottom so that everybody can rise.
Take back the mic, take back the mic, take back the mic, take back the mic.
We are the poor, the marginalized, and the underpaid. And we are taking one step forward to say that everybody has a right to live.
Poverty is not the fault of those who are impoverished. It is caused by those who make the policy.
There are over 135 million poor and low-wage, low-income people in this nation.
The biggest block of potential voters by far is low-income, low-wage voters.
I can't afford medicine. Sometimes I have to skip because of the cost.
The farm worker community is tired of the violence imposed upon us by greed, exclusion, and denial of basic human rights.
Those folk that represented by that casket Poor and low-wage workers who are the most moral people in this country because they go to work every day believing, even though going to work is hazardous to their health.
I'm tired of working 70 to 80 hours a week and still not have money for the necessity of bills. I'm tired of getting sick and not being able to go see the doctor. Having to make a choice to pay between rent or the light bill or food or clothes.
You cannot claim to care about families and a culture of life and then do everything in your power to rob people of equal access to resources and to force them to live in poverty.
Leadership of both parties have waged war on poor people and low-wage workers.
And this government has treated people experiencing poverty, including their military families, with disdainful, deliberate, malicious neglect.
So the truth is that my son died from poverty.
We refuse to accept poverty as the fourth leading cause of death.
The fourth leading cause of death in this, the richest country in the world.
We march today for our children and the generations to come.
And we need to do it with the loudest voices possible, the biggest actions possible.
We will voice our demands and register our vote.
When we stand up and when we stand together, things change.
There is the electorate that is, and then there is the electorate that should be.
34 million eligible poor and low-income voters did not vote in 2016. If just 20% of those voters in swing states were mobilized around an agenda, they could change the political outcome of every election. So we're launching the most massive voter mobilization and turnout campaign in history of poor and low-wage voters, allies, and religious leaders.
People are dying, but we know it doesn't have to be this way. And so we are calling on everyone to join us in this Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
We are here, we will be seen, we will be heard, and our power will be felt. We don't need to be an insurrection. We are a resurrection that will be felt across this country. Are you ready? 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 We are a resurrection, and we are ready. And we won't be silent anymore.
For me, why all of this is so vitally important is because I've long talked about the need for there to be a reprogramming of African Americans, in that how we approach certain things, how we look at certain things. And when you begin to read and begin to study and begin to realize how powerful white supremacy has been, what it has created, but not just white supremacy, how it's impacted African Americans, also how white supremacy has impacted whites, in that what this other framing of the story has done is to give them a false view. And I believe, which was the thesis of my book, White Fear, the reason these white folks, these baby boomers, and some of these Gen Xers are so angry right now is because they can't handle the fact that their white children and their white grandchildren are now hearing the other side of the story. And they're now looking at America in a much different way. And they're now challenging America. And so this effort to attack DEI and critical race theory, to attack anything dealing with race, where you're right, white kid in a government class is uncomfortable when civil rights comes up, so the class is canceled. Let's not show, the language in this movie about Ruby Bridges. We can't have a little young white kid seeing that because they might feel bad when they hear the N-word being spoken, because they might start asking, Grandmama, was that you? And so that's really what we're dealing with. And we're dealing with people, if they say, if we could just stop the Gerald Horns of the world from writing and teaching and these white kids from learning, then we may hold on to this fallacy as long as we can. And that's really what the aim is.
Well, I'm afraid that you're right, but I hope I'm not going out on a limb when I suggest that that is a losing struggle. Because even if somehow the Governor DeSantis of the world were able to circumscribe the teaching of accurate renditions of Black history in Florida, that does not necessarily mean that that particular campaign will succeed in Brooklyn. It does not necessarily mean that it'll succeed in Berkeley or Los Angeles. And given that this is one country, which is wired through broadband, it will not be that difficult for the kids in Florida to get stories from Los Angeles, from Berkeley, and from Brooklyn. And another thing, Roland, I'm on the project, and just before we got on this call, I was looking at reports from Ethiopia in the 1920s, where this Ethiopia, of course, at that particular time was one of the few sovereign states, along with Liberia, which was basically a neo-colony in a sense of the United States. And Ethiopia was wielding significant diplomatic influence because it was independent and sovereign. It was being courted by Russia, being courted by France, England, Italy, etc. And the leaders were playing off one against another. And the United States was trying to curry favor with Ethiopia. And so they were asking the Ethiopians to send their young people to the United States to study, which the Ethiopians did. But then the young Ethiopians began to complain about Jim Crow and US apartheid, which was worsening the US reputation in Addis Ababa. And so this puts pressure on the United States to move away from that hateful, spiteful system, which ultimately then benefits Black Americans, people like your grandparents and my grandparents. And so once again, in the 21st century, Florida is not an island. It's going to be very difficult for Florida to push through these anti-Black policies, not only in the face of opposition from Berkeley, Brooklyn, and Los Angeles, but also in the face of global opposition from Africans. Now the entire continent virtually is sovereign. The United States actually wants to attract more Black students to campuses here because to this point, the leading foreign students came from China, but now the United States-China relations are headed south. And so they want to replace these Chinese students with African students. But how are they going to do that when Black people are treated so shabbily in this country? So once again, you see this global pressure, this global dynamic, and hopefully that will lead to a reversal of Governor DeSantis's policies.
As you were talking, I'm sitting here pulling up various items and how folks are framing different things, describing the Texas Revolution, talking about it was a cause about federalism, it was about freedom, it was about independence. And see, again, those are buzzwords that's very easy to rally around. Yes, we love the idea of being separate and independent and not having Mexican authorities in control of this. But as you laid out, they were abolitionists in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had folks who were angry with that. Just like all these people are just, boy, that Lord have mercy. They really hot at you when you framed the issue with the ending of slavery in Britain as one of the reasons for the American Revolution. And all the historians, oh, absolutely not. It had nothing to do with that. And again, it goes to this denial of the reality of how powerful slavery was. And for the people who who are clueless, it was the principal economic engine of America. And so this to act as if, oh, that was just sort of one part of this is really it was really other issues. No, you can't say it was everything. It was the central thing. And so again, what you have are folks who do not want that to be told. And so, and now that we can read, now that we can research, now that we can write, I use the phrase all the time, Gerald. We are living examples of their worst nightmare. Negroes who can read. And now we can write, and now we can publish, and now we can broadcast. Oh hell, we are absolutely a threat to this whole system.
Well, it's interesting. It's not only that on the verge of the U.S. Civil War, 1860, the investment in the bodies of enslaved Africans was the most valuable investment in this country, more valuable than the railroads and the factories than the mines. It's not only that, but when slavery was abolished in 1865, or per my previous remarks, guaranteed in 1867 with the overthrow of the French occupiers in Mexico, what happened is that those who controlled those billions in property, their property was taken without compensation. Now, interestingly enough, when slavery was ultimately abolished in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, etc., the enslavers were compensated. Up until a few years ago, London was continuing to pay off the descendants of the families who owned the enslaved. You know the story, I'm sure, about the abolition of slavery by force of arms in what is now Haiti, and then independent Haiti forced to pay reparations to the enslavers, which has crippled independent Haiti to this very day. In the United States, there was no compensation paid to those whose property, quote unquote, was taken, quote unquote. And obviously that generates fury. When I'm teaching classes at the University of Houston and telling this story, you know how students are today. I'm lecturing and they're fiddling with their smartphones for whatever reason, on TikTok or Facebook or whatever. And sometimes I'll go and snatch the smartphone from the student's hand and say, look, I've just taken your property without compensation. You're angry, right? You're furious, right? You want to take me outside and thrash me. Well, that's how the enslavers felt, or the former enslavers, I should say, felt in Texas and a good deal of Dixie, which leads to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which had one of its strongest chapters in Texas, by the way. The Ku Klux Klan, for those who have been living under a rock in recent decades, was the terrorist white supremacist organization that sought to bring back what they considered to be the good old days of relentless and ruthless exploitation of people of African descent. And I would argue that in part, that decision is still relevant. That is to say, the decision to expropriate the property of the enslavers without compensation, because I think it helps to generate this anti-Washington sentiment that you now see. Anything coming out of Washington, according to the conservatives, is bad, unless, of course, it benefits the military-industrial complex or the oil industry, et cetera. But, you know, they'll basically organize a relentless campaign against what they call Obamacare, because it's coming out of Washington and is at the behest of a president of African descent. You have many people going against their own interests just because it comes out of Washington, for example. The U.S. economy may seize up within weeks because of this debate over the United States paying its debts, which could jeopardize the potency and the viability of the entire U.S. economy, generated by this anti-Washington sentiment that I would argue comes from the fact that it was Washington, the federal government, that presided over the expropriation of their property without compensation. It was Washington, the federal government, that defeated the dream of establishing a so-called Confederate States of America that would enslave Africans forevermore. And until we come to these very basic realizations, I'm afraid to say we're always going to be stumbling around in the dark.
Time to get paid, blow up like
Fanbase exclusive audio rooms are here. Now tap, talk, and get paid. Monetize your live podcast and most engaging conversations. You can now create exclusive audio chat rooms only for your subscribers and biggest fans. And as a user, subscribe, listen, and talk to your favorite creators. Now tap, talk, and get paid. Because everyone's a fan of something, and everyone has a fan base.
I'm blowing up like you thought I, and if you don't know, I'm
when we talk about the Great Compromise of 1877, which ushers in 92 years of Jim Crow. When we think about even with the state of Texas, the battles there when it came to Thurgood Marshall and NAACP and others trying to break the backs of the Democratic primaries. When we look at, again, the systems that we're putting in place, as you laid out, Jim Crow and the roots of U.S. fascism. I mean, what people just simply refuse to acknowledge is that all of these things, you have to look at present day things and to understand what led up to this, what created this, what put this in place, the boundaries, the living conditions. When you just think back to just the treatment. There's a movie being made about that black brigade of soldiers who got so sick of racism, went on and just started killing white folks in Houston. And very few people even know about that story. And so when you talk about this counter-revolution of 1836, we talk about Juneteenth. I keep reminding people, y'all, the celebration of Juneteenth by Black folks wasn't just about General Granger. It was literally this continual quest for freedom in Texas and in America.
Well, I'm happy to hear that a movie is being made about what's been called the Camp Logan Mutiny of August 1917 in the city of Houston, when, as you suggest, Black soldiers, many of whom were not necessarily familiar with the peculiar folkways of Jim Crow then obtaining in Houston, whereby you had to sit in the back of the trolley, whereby you were not allowed to go into certain stores to try on clothes or shoes before you could buy them. That's one of the reasons why, if you look at old photographs, you'll oftentimes find Black people in ill-fitting garments because they're not allowed to try them on before they buy them. And as a result of what these soldiers perceived in terms of the roughhousing and manhandling of Black women in particular by the Houston Police Department, they decide to run amok, as it was described in the commercial press at that time, and began shooting up the place. And of course, they're eventually subdued, eventually executed en masse. And you are correct, even though that particular dastardly episode took place within walking distance of where I'm sitting right now, I dare say that if we were to go out on the streets of Houston and interview some of the passersby about that startling episode, many of them would not have heard of it. And that's part of the whitewashing of US history, the whitewashing of Black American history. It's part of this crusade, as noted, that Governor DeSantis is carrying out, but it's not just Governor DeSantis. You mentioned the 1619 Project of Howard University's Nicole Hannah-Jones, formerly of the New York Times, which sought to place the experience of Black people into center of a new story of the history of this country. It led to Mr. Trump, when he was president, and paneling a so-called 1776 commission. I understand that Texas has an 1836 commission to try to rebut particular narratives that seek to tell a truer story of the history of this state, such as represented in the book we're discussing now. And I think, as noted, that those who are seeking to rewrite history, or I should say more accurately, whitewash history, that they should recognize that I trust and I hope that is a losing gambit. It's a fool's errand, and it will not end well.
So as we were talking, because I remember it was during the pandemic that I had read about this, and the movie actually was done. It was called The 24th. It's streaming on Amazon Prime, and so it actually was released. It's a fictionalized version of what took place, but the movie is called The 24th. So yeah, it was. So I'll have to check that out a little bit later when I pull up Amazon Prime. A few minutes left here. I always ask you this question. I ask every author this question. I think when we talked about I never forget we talked about because you brought up the Juneteenth piece. And matter of fact, I'm going to deal with that before I go to the other question. Because when we talked, the previous book about boxing, you told the story that I was even shocked, and you said it blew you away when you found out that when General Granger showed up, he had some brothers with him.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, the Houston Chronicle in 2021, when they were marking Juneteenth, Houston Chronicle, of course, is the major newspaper in this part of Texas. They suggested that with General Granger was a brigade of soldiers, 75% of whom were African descent. And there's another story, too, to show you how Black history works. The French, as you know, continue to be major neo-colonizers in Africa. That was beginning during the time when they seized Mexico. So from their colonial perch in what is today's Chad in Africa, they dispatched hundreds of soldiers across the Atlantic to bolster their collapsing regime. And so you had Black soldiers on both sides of the barricades. Black soldiers with General Granger, with the Washington government seeking to repulse the enslavers. And then you had Africans under the aegis of the French who were fighting them. And what I think that this serves to illustrate is not only that Black history is much more complicated than many would imagine, but also I think it illustrates a deeper point, which is going to be important going forward as world demographics change and as a more sizable percentage of human population becomes of African descent. You'll see that these North Atlantic powers, such as represented in Washington and Paris, are going to have to rely more upon Black people's strength, but that's going to be difficult to do as long as, per Governor DeSantis, they're trying to feed us fairy tales about our past, which only helps to generate anger and fury, and hopefully will help to generate an eroding popularity for politicians like General DeSantis.
Last two questions. First, what do you want someone who is in Texas or someone who's not from Texas, what do you want them to take away from this 500 plus page book?
A number of things. One, I want these readers to have a better understanding of how we got to this point, a better understanding that's not grounded and based on fairy tales, but grounded and based on fact. And secondly, per the subtitle of this book, there may be dark days ahead. The kinds of police terror and our disproportionate sighting on death row is horrid. But given what may be around the corner, believe it or not, given what may be around the corner, we may be looking back at March 2023 as the good old days, as the golden days, believe it or not. And therefore, I would want readers to take away knowledge, because knowledge ultimately is power, and power is what we need in order to repel and repulse those who want to drive us deeper into a ditch.
And the question I always ask every author, doing all the research, is something that always jumps out, is a wow moment. For this book, what was the wow moment?
Well, I've just uttered it when I found out that there were all these Africans who crossed the Atlantic to fight alongside the French against Black Americans. And in fact, we also know that many of them did not return to what is today's Chad. And so
wow.
You may have in Mexico, you may have in Southern Texas, Black people who are not products of the African slave trade as we understand it, but who are descendants of these Black soldiers who were fighting on behalf of French occupiers in Mexico. I have to say, I didn't know about that before I stumbled across it.
Wow. That's always the amazing thing when one is doing research into our history. And again, and it's the untold history that folks don't realize that is always there. The counter-revolution of 1836, Texas slavery and Jim Crow, and the roots of U.S. fascism. I tell you, Gerald, when I was at the Texas State Capitol, when I saw that big-ass Confederate monument on the Capitol grounds, all I could do was spit on it because there's nothing more shameful than to go to the Texas Capitol. And again, this is you're dealing with today, and you've seen this massive Confederate monument, and they're trying to claim, oh, they were fighting for a just cause. And I'm like, hell no, they were not.
Hey, good for you, man. I'm glad to hear that you expended some of your body fluid on that monument.
Absolutely. Recorded a video, trashed it, and will forever trash it. Gerald, I appreciate it. Great book. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Good luck.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
Oh, no punches!
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland. Stay Black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
When COVID happened, poor people were dying at a rate already of 800 people a day. Before COVID, if you went to a funeral every single day, it would take you 600 years to attend all the funerals of the people who will die from the ravages of policy violence, poverty, and low wages in America in just 1 year. It would take you 2 years and 19 days to go to all of the funerals of the people that will die today, and oftentimes silence. Nobody talks about this political genocide, but we are determined today to remember their death and be a resurrection of voting power and voice power like never before.
Economic justice and saving this democracy are deeply connected. We, as a nation, must listen to the demands of the poor, who are pushing and will continue to push political candidates and elected leaders to lift from the bottom so that everybody can rise.
We are the poor, the marginalized, and the underpaid. And we are taking one step forward to say that everybody has a right to live.
Poverty is not the fault of those who are impoverished. It is caused by those who make the policy.
There are over 135 million poor and low-wage, low-income people in this nation.
The biggest block of potential voters by far is low-income, low-wage voters.
I can't afford medicine. Sometimes I have to skip because of the cost.
The farm worker community is tired of the violence imposed upon us by greed, exclusion, and denial of basic human rights.
Those folk that represented by that casket Poor and low-wage workers who are the most moral people in this country because they go to work every day believing, even though going to work is hazardous to their health.
I'm tired of working 70 to 80 hours a week and still not have money for the necessity of bills. I'm tired of getting sick and not being able to go see the doctor. Having to make a choice to pay between rent or the light bill or food or clothes.
You cannot claim to care about families and a culture of life and then do everything in your power to rob people of equal access to resources and to force them to live in poverty.
Leadership of both parties have waged war on poor people and low-wage workers.
And this government has treated people experiencing poverty, including their military families, with disdainful, deliberate, malicious neglect.
So the truth is that my son died from poverty.
We refuse to accept poverty as the fourth leading cause of death.
The fourth leading cause of death in this, the richest country in the world.
We march today for our children and the generations to come.
And we need to do it with the loudest voices possible, the biggest actions possible.
We will voice our demands and register our vote.
When we stand up and when we stand together, things change.
There is the electorate that is, and then there is the electorate that should be.
34 million eligible poor and low-income voters did not vote in 2016. If just 20% of those voters in swing states were mobilized around an agenda, they could change the political outcome of every election. So we're launching the most massive voter mobilization and turnout campaign in history of poor and low-wage voters, allies, and religious leaders.
People are dying, but we know it doesn't have to be this way. And so we are calling on everyone to join us in this Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival.
We are here, we will be seen, we will be heard, and our power will be felt. We don't need to be an insurrection. We are a resurrection that will be felt across this country. Are you ready? 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 We are a resurrection, and we are ready. And